Somewhere in the middle of an unremarkable week, long after the messages stopped and the explanations stopped arriving, an avoidant sits with a thought they cannot quite shake, one that keeps circling back, no matter how many times they try to redirect their attention elsewhere. It isn't a thought about missing someone, though it might masquerade as that at first. It's a thought about themselves, specific and uncomfortable, arriving with a clarity that months of arguments and conversations never managed to produce. And the strange part, the part that catches them off guard every time it resurfaces, is that nothing prompted it directly. No accusation, no confrontation, just quiet, sustained absence, doing something that every previous attempt at communication somehow failed to do. If the listener has spent time wondering whether choosing to stop reaching out actually accomplished anything, whether walking away in silence rather than one final attempt at explanation made any real difference at all, this exploration is going to trace exactly how that silence tends to work, slowly and invisibly, on a mind that has spent years building walls specifically designed to keep this kind of reckoning out. To understand why silence succeeds where conversation so often fails, it helps to first understand what conversation actually provides an avoidant, whether they realize it or not. Every argument, every tearful explanation, every patient attempt to describe how a specific behavior caused pain gives the avoidant something to respond to, something to manage, something to survive rather than absorb. Words invite defense. They invite the avoidant's well-practiced instinct to counter, to minimize, to redirect blame, just enough that the full weight of what's being said never quite lands. This isn't necessarily conscious manipulation. It's simply the automatic function of a nervous system trained over years to treat emotional confrontation as something to be neutralized rather than received. As long as there's a voice on the other end of the conversation, the avoidant has somewhere to direct their energy besides the truth of what's actually being described. Silence removes this outlet entirely, and the removal is what makes it so much more effective than anything spoken aloud ever managed to be. When there's no one left to argue with, no fresh explanation arriving to counter, no voice inviting a response, the avoidant's usual defensive machinery has nothing left to grab onto. It idles, and into that idle space, uninvited and unfamiliar, creeps the exact kind of reflection the avoidant spent the entire relationship successfully avoiding. This is not a dramatic process. It rarely resembles a single moment of enlightenment. It looks more like slow erosion, small and persistent, chipping away at a wall that used to feel solid enough to withstand almost anything thrown at it directly. It's worth pausing to acknowledge something for the listener who chose this particular kind of silence, who walked away without a final speech, without one more attempt to make the avoidant finally understand. That restraint often gets misread, even by the person practicing it, as giving up too easily, as failing to fight hard enough for something that mattered. What actually happened was closer to the opposite. Fighting harder, saying more, explaining further, would have simply given the avoidant more material to defend against. Choosing quiet withdrawal instead removed the very thing their defenses were built to handle, and in doing so, created conditions for a kind of reckoning that no amount of additional explanation could have produced. There's a specific mechanism worth examining here, one that explains why an avoidant's toxic patterns so often remain invisible to them while a relationship is still active, regardless of how clearly those patterns are described by the person experiencing them. Patterns require repetition to become visible, and repetition requires enough distance from any single instance to notice the shape connecting one moment to the next. While a relationship is ongoing, the avoidant experiences each individual incident, each moment of withdrawal, each instance of sarcasm deployed instead of honesty, as isolated and justified by its specific context. There was a reason for that particular silence, a reason for that particular deflection, always something external to point to that made the moment feel separate from every other moment like it. It's only once the relationship ends, once there's no new incident arriving to distract from the accumulated pattern, that the shape connecting all those individual moments becomes possible to see clearly. This is where the specific quality of silence matters enormously. because it isn't simply the absence of a relationship that produces this recognition. Plenty of relationships end without prompting any real growth in the person who caused the most harm. What makes a difference is the specific combination of ending and quiet, the complete removal of any ongoing dynamic that might otherwise keep supplying fresh distractions, fresh conflicts, fresh material for the avoidance mind to focus on instead of the accumulated pattern sitting quietly beneath the surface. A relationship that ends with continued friction, continued contact, continued opportunities for new arguments rarely produces this kind of reflection, because there's always something newer and more immediate competing for attention. It's specifically the stillness, the absence of anything new happening at all, that finally lets the older patterns surface into full view. It's worth exploring what this process actually feels like from inside the avoidance experience, at least as far as it can be described from the outside, because understanding the texture of it may help the listener recognize what's likely happening, even without any direct evidence of it. The earliest stage tends to involve a persistent, low-grade restlessness, an unfamiliar discomfort that doesn't attach itself to anything specific. The avoidant might notice themselves unusually irritable, unusually distracted, unable to fully settle into activities that used to provide reliable distraction. This restlessness is often the first external sign of an internal process that hasn't yet organized itself into anything the avoidant could name directly, the beginning of a pattern trying to surface against considerable internal resistance. As this restlessness continues, usually over a period of weeks or months rather than days, it tends to sharpen into something more specific, individual memories resurfacing with unusual clarity, no longer softened by the defensive reframing that used to accompany them automatically. A moment of coldness that once felt reasonable in context starts to feel simply cold, full stop, without the surrounding justification that used to make it feel acceptable. A pattern of deflection that once seemed like harmless personality quirk starts to look, uncomfortably, like a repeated failure to ever meet someone halfway. These individual recognitions accumulate slowly, each one uncomfortable on its own, together forming a picture the avoidant can no longer easily dismiss as an isolated misunderstanding or an unfair characterization. There's something worth naming about how this process interacts with an avoidance relationship to their own intelligence and self-perception, because most avoidants pride themselves, at least privately, on being perceptive, on understanding people and situations with more clarity than average. This self-perception makes the eventual recognition of their own blind spots particularly disorienting. It's one thing to be told directly that a specific behavior was harmful. It's another thing entirely to arrive, independently and without external prompting, at the conclusion that an entire category of one's own behavior has been operating on autopilot for years, invisible not because it was subtle, but because the avoidant's own defensive structure was specifically designed to keep it hidden from view. This particular disorientation, the collision between self-perceived perceptiveness and newly discovered blindness, often produces more lasting change than any external accusation ever could, precisely because it cannot be dismissed as someone else's misreading of the situation. For the listener who has wondered whether their silence was somehow too passive, too indirect, to actually produce any meaningful consequence, it's worth reframing what passivity actually means in this context. Silence, chosen deliberately rather than defaulted into out of exhaustion or fear, is not the same as doing nothing. It is a specific active decision to stop supplying the raw material an avoidance defenses need in order to keep functioning. This decision requires real discipline, particularly in the early weeks when the urge to reach out one more time, to try one more explanation, tends to run strongest. Maintaining silence through that urge, choosing consistently not to reopen a channel the avoidant could use to deflect or minimize, is far more active than it might feel from the inside while it's happening. It's worth examining too what typically happens once this internal recognition reaches a point where the avoidant can no longer fully deny it, because the aftermath rarely resembles a clean, satisfying resolution. Recognition of one's own toxic patterns doesn't automatically produce repair, doesn't automatically produce an apology delivered to the person whose silence made the recognition possible, doesn't automatically translate into meaningfully different behavior in whatever relationships follow. What it does produce, reliably, is discomfort, a persistent awareness that something in how the avoidant relates to closeness has been quietly causing harm for longer than they'd like to admit. Some avoidants respond to this discomfort by finally seeking help, therapy, or self-directed reading or honest conversations with people they trust enough to be vulnerable with. Others respond by burying the discomfort more deeply, distracting themselves with new relationships or new environments before the recognition has a chance to fully take hold. Neither response is guaranteed, and the listener maintaining silence has no way to know, in real time, which path any specific avoidant is likely to take. This uncertainty deserves honest acknowledgement because it would be misleading to suggest silence works as a guaranteed intervention that reliably produces growth every time it's deployed. What silence reliably produces is the space in which growth becomes possible, removing the obstacles that would otherwise prevent that growth from occurring, but it cannot force an outcome that ultimately depends on the avoidant's own willingness to sit with discomfort rather than distract from it indefinitely. Some avoidants take this opportunity and use it well, emerging from the silence with genuine insight that eventually shapes healthier relationships going forward. Others let the discomfort pass without ever fully metabolizing what it was trying to teach them, moving on to new distractions before the recognition can fully settle into lasting change. There's a physical component to this internal shift worth describing carefully, because it doesn't remain purely cognitive the way a simple realization might. Avoidant defenses aren't only psychological. They're embodied, held in the shoulders, in the jaw, in a chronic low-grade tension that most avoidants have carried for so long they no longer notice it as anything unusual. When the usual triggers for that tension disappear, when there's no ongoing conflict demanding vigilance, no partner's disappointment to brace against, something in the body has room to soften that wasn't available before. This softening isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it produces exhaustion that seems to arrive from nowhere, a heaviness that makes sense only in retrospect, once the avoidant understands it as the release of tension they'd been unconsciously maintaining for years. The body, in this sense, often registers the shift before the mind fully catches up to what it means. It's worth exploring how this bodily component interacts with sleep and rest, because many avoidants report, whether to a therapist or simply in passing conversation with a friend, unusually disrupted sleep during the specific period when this internal reckoning is actively unfolding. This disruption tends to differ from the anxious insomnia that sometimes follows a breakup in its earliest days. It arrives later, often weeks or months after the initial adjustment to being alone has already settled, and it carries a different texture, less panicked and more contemplative, as though the mind has finally found enough quiet to process material it had been keeping at bay through sheer busyness and distraction. Dreams, during this period, sometimes surface old memories with unusual vividness, replaying specific conversations or moments the avoidant thought they had long since filed away and forgotten. There's something worth naming about how this process differs across avoidants, depending on how they've historically related to introspection more broadly. Some avoidants, despite their relational guardedness, maintain a genuine capacity for self-reflection in other areas of life: professional feedback, creative pursuits, personal growth pursued independent of relationships. For these avoidants, silence tends to accelerate an existing muscle, redirecting a reflective capacity they already possess toward a domain they'd previously kept walled off from that same scrutiny. Other avoidants have spent their entire lives avoiding introspection in nearly every domain, treating self-examination itself as a kind of threat, regardless of context. For this second group, the process silence sets in motion tends to unfold much more slowly, sometimes taking years rather than months, and sometimes never fully completing at all. The recognition arriving in fragments that never quite assemble into the full, coherent understanding a more reflective person might eventually reach. It's worth exploring too how mutual friends and shared social circles factor into this process, because they often play a role the avoidant doesn't anticipate while still inside the relationship. Once the silence sets in and direct contact ends, mutual friends frequently become an unintentional source of accountability, mentioning offhand how the other person seems to be doing, how they've described the relationship's ending in conversations that never reach the avoidant directly. These secondhand fragments, filtered through people the avoidant still trusts and respects, often carry more weight than anything the avoidant could have heard directly from the person they hurt, precisely because they arrive without the defensive charge of a direct confrontation. Hearing, secondhand, that someone the avoidant hurt has described specific behaviour in plain, unflattering terms, without any accompanying argument to counter, tends to land with unusual force, another quiet contributor to the same slow process of recognition that silence itself set into motion. This is worth pausing on for a moment because it reveals something important about how thoroughly silence can work even indirectly, through channels the person choosing it never controls or anticipates. Someone who chooses to stop reaching out doesn't need to manage every aspect of how their absence gets interpreted or discussed within a shared social world. The silence itself creates a kind of vacuum that other information, other conversations, other perspectives inevitably rush in to fill, and much of that information ends up reinforcing exactly the reflection the direct silence was already encouraging. This isn't something that requires any deliberate strategy on the part of the person who walked away. It happens naturally as a consequence of relationships existing within broader social ecosystems that continue functioning independent of the two people most directly involved. There's a particular kind of relief worth naming for the listener who might be carrying some guilt about the silence itself, wondering whether choosing not to explain, not to offer one final conversation, was somehow unkind or incomplete. It's worth remembering that clarity was very likely already offered, probably multiple times throughout the relationship itself, in the countless conversations that tried and failed to produce real change. The absence of one more explanation at the end doesn't represent a failure to communicate. It represents an accurate assessment that communication alone had already proven insufficient, and that something different, something silence alone could provide, was needed instead. This reframing matters because it removes an unnecessary layer of guilt from a decision that was, in reality, both reasonable and, as this exploration has traced throughout, often remarkably effective. It's worth examining, finally, how this entire process connects to a broader truth about how meaningful change tends to happen for people whose defences are built specifically around avoiding vulnerability. Change rarely arrives through persuasion, however well-intentioned or carefully worded that persuasion might be. It arrives through consequence, through the removal of whatever was previously allowing a harmful pattern to continue without cost. This is true across nearly every domain of human behaviour, not just within romantic relationships, and it's worth remembering as a general principle whenever the temptation arises to believe that one more conversation, one more careful explanation might succeed where every previous attempt has already failed. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can offer isn't more words. It's the quiet, deliberate removal of an audience that was, without either person fully realising it, making genuine change entirely unnecessary. The value of choosing silence was never contingent on confirming its effect. It was never about waiting to see whether the avoidant eventually reaches out with an apology, whether mutual friends eventually report some visible change, whether any external evidence ever arrives to prove the silence did what it was designed to do. There's an important distinction worth drawing here between silence that stems from genuine boundary setting and silence that stems from simple avoidance or fear, because they can look identical from the outside while producing very different internal experiences for the person maintaining them. Silence chosen deliberately, with clarity about why continued contact wouldn't serve either person's healing, tends to feel grounded even when it's difficult, sustained by conviction rather than by fear of what reopening contact might bring. Silence that stems primarily from fear from an inability to tolerate any further conflict or discomfort, often feels shakier, more prone to sudden reversal at the first sign of the avoidant reaching out with an unexpected gesture of remorse. This distinction matters for the listener trying to understand their own experience of maintaining distance, because the specific quality of the silence, whether it's rooted in clarity or in avoidance, often shapes how sustainable it proves to be over time, and how effectively it ultimately produces the kind of reflection this exploration has been describing. It's worth considering too how this entire dynamic plays out differently, depending on the length and depth of the relationship that preceded it. A brief relationship, only a few months old, rarely produces the kind of deeply entrenched pattern recognition described differently this exploration, simply because there isn't enough accumulated history for a clear pattern to fully register once distance sets in. Longer relationships, particularly those spanning years, tend to produce a much more thorough reckoning, precisely because there's so much more accumulated evidence available once the avoidant finally has enough quiet to review it honestly. This means the listener whose relationship spanned significant time, who invested years rather than months into trying to reach someone who consistently withdrew, may find some grim comfort in understanding that the eventual reckoning, when it arrives, tends to be proportional to what actually happened, not just a brief flicker of guilt, but a sustained confrontation with a genuinely substantial pattern of harm. There's something worth naming too about how children, if they exist within the context of a longer relationship, complicate and sometimes accelerate this process in ways worth understanding separately. An avoidant who shares children with someone they've hurt cannot fully disappear into silence themselves, even if the other person maintains their own boundary around personal contact. Co-parenting requires some degree of ongoing interaction, and this interaction, however limited or businesslike it remains, often provides just enough exposure to keep the avoidant's old patterns visible, without fully reopening the emotional intimacy that once allowed those patterns to hide behind excuses. Watching a former partner parent with consistency, patience, and emotional availability that never wavers, even in the difficult practical logistics of shared custody, can itself become a quiet, ongoing form of the same reflection process described throughout this exploration, sustained not through romantic silence, but through the simple, undeniable evidence of a healthier way of showing up that the avoidant witnesses again and again, without ever being told directly to notice it. It's worth exploring as well how this reckoning tends to interact with an avoidant's professional life, an area many people wouldn't immediately connect to romantic patterns, but which often reflects the same underlying tendencies. Avoidants who struggle with vulnerability in relationships frequently struggle similarly with feedback in professional settings, deflecting criticism, avoiding accountability for mistakes, treating any suggestion of underperformance as a threat to be managed rather than information to be absorbed. As the internal reckoning triggered by romantic silence gradually unfolds, some avoidants find this same pattern beginning to surface in how they process professional feedback as well, an unexpected ripple effect that extends the lessons of one domain into another. They hadn't originally connected to their relational patterns at all. This spillover, when it happens, often represents one of the more concrete, observable signs that genuine internal shift is occurring, visible to colleagues or supervisors, even when it remains completely invisible to the former partner whose silence originally set the whole process into motion. For the listener who has wondered whether maintaining silence for what feels like an unreasonably long time, far longer than initially anticipated, means something has gone wrong with the process itself, it's worth offering some reassurance about timelines generally. There is no fixed schedule for how long this kind of internal reckoning takes to fully develop, and impatience about the pace of someone else's growth, however understandable, rarely serves the person waiting for evidence of it. Some avoidants show visible signs of change within months. Others take years, and some, as acknowledged earlier, never complete the process at all, remaining defended against the recognition indefinitely despite every condition being in place to support it. The listener's task was never to manage or predict this timeline. It was simply to create the conditions through consistent, genuine silence that made growth possible, and having done that, the outcome genuinely belongs to someone else now, unfolding on a schedule entirely outside anyone else's influence or control. There's a final layer worth naming here about what this entire process reveals regarding the relationship between love and consequence, a relationship many people instinctively resist because it can feel harsh or unloving to allow someone to face the natural results of their own behavior without intervention. But allowing consequence to unfold, rather than continuously softening it through explanation, patience, or renewed effort, is often one of the more loving things a person can do for someone stuck in a pattern that active intervention has already failed to interrupt. This isn't coldness. It's a recognition that some lessons can only be learned through the genuine experience of loss, through the specific discomfort of silence that cannot be argued with or explained away, and that continuing to soften this experience, however well-intentioned, often only delays the very growth that silence, given enough time, tends to make possible. The value existed in the choice itself, in refusing to keep supplying the emotional labor that was allowing a harmful pattern to continue unexamined, in trusting that removing that labor was more likely to produce real reflection than any further explanation could have managed. Whatever the avoidant eventually does with the space that silence created belongs entirely to them now, and the listener's decision to create that space, regardless of its outcome, remains a complete and worthwhile act on its own. What lingers long after the specific relationship has faded into something closer to memory than active feeling is a quieter kind of knowing that doesn't depend on ever hearing confirmation from the other side. It is the knowledge that silence, chosen deliberately and held with genuine conviction, did something conversation alone had already proven incapable of doing, whether or not that something ever gets acknowledged, whether or not it ever produces a message, an apology, or any visible sign at all. Some forms of impact simply don't announce themselves, and this is very often one of them, working quietly and steadily in the background of someone else's private life, entirely independent of whether anyone ever thinks to say thank you for it, or ever even fully realizes it happened at all, tucked quietly beneath the surface of a whole life, slowly, gradually, and genuinely, slowly, quietly, becoming a little more whole and honest than it ever used to be.